Welcome back to Decentralized Application Development Crashcasts. I'm Sheila, and before we dive in, I'd like to remind our listeners to rate our podcast on whatever platform you're tuning in from. Your feedback helps us grow and improve the show. Today, we're continuing our journey through Chapter 1, Understanding Decentralization, and we'll be exploring the fascinating topic of centralization versus decentralization. To kick things off, I have a quiz question for our listeners. Ready, Victor?
Absolutely, Sheila. I'm excited to hear what you've got for our listeners today.
All right. Here's the quiz question. Which of the following is not typically associated with a centralized system? A. Single point of failure. B. Faster decision-making. C. Enhanced privacy. Or D. Easier regulatory compliance.
Ooh, that's an intriguing question, Sheila. It really makes you think about the characteristics of centralized systems. I like how it challenges our assumptions about what centralization entails. Without giving away the answer, I think this question will help our listeners focus on the key differences between centralized and decentralized systems as we discuss the topic.
Excellent point, Victor. Now, before we dive deeper, could you give us a quick refresher on what we mean by centralization and decentralization?
Certainly, Sheila. Centralization refers to a system where control, decision-making, and data management are concentrated in a single point or a small group of entities. On the other hand, decentralization distributes these functions across multiple nodes or participants in the network. Think of centralization as a pyramid with power at the top, while decentralization is more like a web of interconnected nodes.
That's a helpful analogy, Victor. So if we consider something like a traditional bank, that would be a centralized system, right? How does that compare to a decentralized alternative?
Exactly right, Sheila. A traditional bank is a perfect example of a centralized system. All account information, transactions, and decision-making power are controlled by the bank itself. In contrast, a decentralized alternative like Bitcoin operates on a network where multiple participants, miners, and nodes maintain copies of the ledger and validate transactions. There's no single entity in control.
I see. So, in the case of a bank, if their central servers go down, it could potentially affect all their customers. But with a decentralized system like Bitcoin, even if some nodes fail, the network can continue to function. Is that correct?
That's spot on, Sheila. This brings us to one of the key advantages of decentralized systems: resilience. Because there's no single point of failure, decentralized systems can often continue operating even if parts of the network are compromised or offline. However, it's important to note that centralized systems have their own advantages too. For instance, they often can make decisions and implement changes much faster than decentralized systems.
That's interesting, Victor. It seems like there's a trade-off between resilience and efficiency. Are there other trade-offs we should consider when comparing centralized and decentralized systems?
Absolutely, Sheila. Another significant trade-off is between control and autonomy. Centralized systems offer more direct control, which can be beneficial for enforcing standards or regulations. For example, a central bank can quickly adjust monetary policy. However, this control comes at the cost of individual autonomy. Decentralized systems, on the other hand, offer more freedom to participants but can sometimes struggle with coordination and consensus.
I can see how that might play out in real-world scenarios. Can you give us an example of where a decentralized approach has shown advantages over a centralized one?
Certainly. One compelling example is the evolution of file sharing. Remember Napster? It was a centralized peer-to-peer file-sharing service that was shut down due to legal issues. This led to the development of more decentralized file-sharing protocols like BitTorrent. Because BitTorrent doesn't rely on central servers, it's much more resistant to shutdowns and censorship. This resilience has made it a popular choice for distributing large files, including legitimate uses like software updates and open-source projects.
That's a great example, Victor. It really highlights how decentralization can provide robustness against certain types of failures or attacks. But I'm curious, are there situations where centralization is still preferred?
Absolutely, Sheila. Centralization still has its place in many scenarios. For instance, in situations where quick decision-making and coordinated action are crucial, centralized systems often perform better. Military command structures are a good example of this. Also, for many businesses, centralized systems can be more cost-effective and easier to manage, especially when dealing with sensitive data that requires strict access controls.
I see. So it's not really about one approach being universally better than the other, but rather choosing the right approach for the specific needs of a system or organization.
Exactly right, Sheila. It's all about understanding the trade-offs and choosing the approach that best fits the requirements. In fact, many modern systems use a hybrid approach, combining elements of both centralization and decentralization to balance their strengths and weaknesses.
That makes a lot of sense, Victor. Now, I'm sure there are some common misconceptions about centralization and decentralization. Could you address a few of those?
Of course, Sheila. One common misconception is that decentralized systems are always more secure than centralized ones. While decentralization can provide certain security benefits, it also introduces new attack vectors. For instance, in a decentralized network, each node could potentially be a point of vulnerability. Another misconception is that decentralized systems are always slower or less efficient. While this can be true in some cases, well-designed decentralized systems can actually be quite efficient and scalable.
Those are important points to keep in mind, Victor. As we wrap up, could you share a fun fact or anecdote related to centralization versus decentralization?
Sure thing, Sheila. Here's an interesting tidbit. The Internet itself was originally designed as a decentralized system to ensure communication could continue even if parts of the network were destroyed in a nuclear war. However, over time, it has become increasingly centralized with the rise of big tech companies and cloud services. This ongoing tension between centralization and decentralization is a fascinating aspect of the Internet's evolution.
That is fascinating, Victor. It really underscores how the balance between centralization and decentralization is an ongoing process. Now, before we conclude, let's reveal the answer to our quiz question. The correct answer is C, enhanced privacy. While centralized systems can implement strong privacy measures, enhanced privacy is typically associated with decentralized systems where user data isn't concentrated in a single location.
Great question and explanation, Sheila. It really highlights one of the key differences between these two approaches.
Thank you, Victor. To summarize today's episode, we've explored the differences between centralized and decentralized systems, their respective advantages and disadvantages, and real-world examples of both. We've learned that neither approach is universally superior. The choice depends on specific needs and contexts. We've also dispelled some common misconceptions and highlighted the ongoing tension between these two approaches in modern systems.
Excellent summary, Sheila. I hope our listeners have gained a deeper understanding of this fundamental concept in decentralized systems.
Indeed, Victor. And to our listeners, remember to visit crashcasts.com and join our Discord community to continue the conversation. If you're enjoying the show, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Your support helps us create more great content like this. Until next time, keep exploring the world of decentralized applications.